Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you for organising the music, one of my favourite songs. It's a great pleasure to be here at this huge gathering, and I thank the organisers for having made all that possible, and I thank you, of course, for turning up on this early Sunday morning. I know that going to events to hear somebody talk on Sunday morning is not something that we atheists are usually in the habit of doing, so makes it all the better. Now, I'm going to begin with a little true incident that happened last night at the dinner, which some of you were here, which illustrates my theme nicely. After dessert was served, there was a lot of standing up and milling around. We were all sitting at, for those who weren't here, we were sitting at tables of 10 or so. And I happened to notice that on the table where I was milling around, somebody had left their wallet in the middle of the table and got up and gone to talk to other people. What a fool! At an atheist convention. Didn't this person know that without God, everything is permitted and there's no morality? That's what Dostoevsky says in the Brothers Karamazov. If there is no God, everything is permitted. If there is no immortality, then there can be no virtue. And many religious people believe this. I've had people writing to me about this quite often. I'll read you a sample email I got a couple of years ago. Dear Sir, I read your writings with much interest, and overall I'm very impressed by them. However, I do have one rather fundamental query. How is it possible to hold notions of good and bad on an atheistic worldview? I understand you apply a utilitarian approach, but why is the greatest happiness for the greatest number a good thing when it's just piles of flesh and bones you are talking about? Why instead can't I define the selfish pursuit of my own interests as good? Who are you or anyone else to say otherwise? Well, it's true that I am a utilitarian, though the greatest happiness of the greatest number isn't completely accurate account of what I do think is a good thing. And of course, if we are talking about happiness, or if we're talking about satisfying human desires or preferences, or the preferences or desires of any sentient being, it can't be just piles of flesh and bones in the vivid image of this writer that we're talking about, because piles of flesh and bones don't experience happiness or pain, and they don't have desires or preferences. There has to be some conscious awareness. There has to be some sentience in the sense of there being subjective experiences for that to be the case. Now, it may of course be that these subjective experiences simply follow from a certain composition of matter, a certain brain physiology state of cells and so on. That's true. We certainly don't need to postulate any kind of special immaterial entities like spirits or souls in order to have subjective experiences. But I do think we need to have subjective experiences for us to have value. And in that sense, the idea that everything is just a pile of flesh and bones doesn't get us there. I think if you imagine a world in which there were no beings capable of conscious experiences at all, there would also be no possibility of morality. Not only that there would be no moral agents capable of thinking about right or wrong, but there would also be no moral patients, if you like. That is, no beings to whom one could do something that would be good or bad, because there would be no value in that world. There would be nothing that could go better or worse. Just as if I were to, say, pick up this glass and hurl it on the floor and smash it into many pieces, it would not really be worse for the glass in itself. It might be a nuisance. We have to watch out to sweep it up. But that's because we care about it. The glass itself does not have any intrinsic states that are good or bad, whereas we do, and non-human animals do as well, because they're capable of feeling pleasure or pain. So that, I think, is where value gets into the universe. But this challenge, whether from Dostoevsky or from the person who sent me that email, does have to be met. We still have to say, well, what is the nature of morality if we don't believe in religion? And I'm going to say a little bit about that and address the reasons why people think that somehow something is missing if you don't believe in God. Something is missing for the concept of morality that people think we need and want to have. And then I'm going to say a little bit more positively about what morality really is all about, how we can understand it on a non-religious worldview. So let's start with this point about, so who is to say what's good or bad without God? This is an ancient question that we find discussed in the beginnings of Western philosophy in ancient Greece 2,500 years ago in Plato. There's a famous dialogue, which I'm sure many of you will have already heard of, known as the Euthyphro. In Plato's dialogues, he typically has Socrates as present. Socrates is a mentor, a teacher, present as one character in the dialogue, the one who puts essentially his viewpoint, and somebody else that he's discussing it with. And in the Euthyphro, Socrates is discussing with Euthyphro what it is to be pious, what piety is. We can, I think, roughly regard this as equivalent to what it is to be good, or what goodness or morality is. And Socrates presents this famous dilemma to Euthyphro. He says, is something good because the gods say that it's good, or is it good, or do the gods say that it's good because it is good? And for somebody who wants to say that morality must come from God, this is, I think, a real insoluble problem to which I haven't seen a satisfactory answer. Because if you say that something is good only because God says it is, you essentially make it arbitrary what good is, and you make God into a kind of arbitrary tyrant. If God had said that it's good to plant bombs in crowded marketplaces and blow up lots of men, women and children as they go about their daily business, then that would be a good thing to do. And there may be some religious people in the world who actually believe that, as we tragically. And conversely, if God had said it's wrong to help somebody in distress when you can easily help them, then it would be wrong to help a stranger in distress. And you can't say, well, but God wouldn't have done that because God is good and God only chooses things that are good, because then, of course, you're saying that there is a notion of good that is independent of what God wills. So either God becomes an arbitrary tyrant, or there is some notion of good or bad independently of what God wills, presumably some objective criteria for saying that it's better to help people in need than to kill and maim them as they go about their daily business. So I don't think we can argue that we need God in order to have a conception of right and wrong at all. There must be some prior idea of right or wrong. Secondly, of course, people often say, well, okay, I'll grant you that there are things that are right and wrong, and I'll take the view that God tells us what's good, and it is good independently of God, but without God, we would not have known what the things were that are good. Well, this really doesn't seem to be the way things work when we look at the knowledge that people have of God. Because, of course, people typically say God reveals to us in the Scriptures what it is that is right or wrong. But, as I'm sure you're all aware and have already heard perhaps from previous speakers, In fact, Christians are highly selective, and other religious people as well who have scriptures, highly selective in what they take from the scriptures and what they regard as good or bad. And there's all sorts of things, some of them quite ridiculous, which it seems, if you read the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, that God tells us to do. Some of them, of course, are quite horrific, like stoning to death somebody who works on the Sabbath. I think one of the most horrific passages in the Hebrew scriptures, if you read it, is in the book of Numbers, chapter 31, where God directs, it's only one of several episodes, where God directs Moses, through Moses, or Moses directs his generals, to go and slaughter a people called the Midianites. Their crime is that apparently some of the women, their neighbours of the Israelites, some of their women have persuaded some of the Israelites to worship their gods, and so God commands the Israelites to go and slaughter all of them, the men and the women, to slaughter the men and to take the women and children, and God says that those of the women who have lain with men you shall slaughter, the boys you shall slaughter, the male children you shall slaughter, only you shall keep the virgin girls, and they you shall take as your wives. So essentially God is telling the Israelites to commit genocide so that the people completely disappear, and simply the women, the girls who could not be pregnant with children of Midianite men are going to be breeding stock for the Israelites. Those verses, of course, get ignored if you talk to Christians. They generally have never heard of those verses. That's not what they're taught in church, not surprisingly. Some of them, of course, will say, and then they will use selective verses to support what they want to support. For example, to condemn homosexuality, which is also condemned. But it's a selective process that's going on, so it's clearly their judgments, not an impartial reading of the scriptures. Some of them will say, well, that's the Old Testament, but we follow Jesus. But Jesus is not really much better in some of the things that he suggests. Of course, he says that to marry a divorced woman is to commit adultery. But there's relatively few Christians who take that as their guidance. He doesn't say anything about abortion, but Christians typically think that abortion is wrong. That clearly doesn't come out of scriptures. And he does insist very forcefully that you must help the poor. Indeed, he tells the rich man that he should sell all that he has and give it to the poor. And he emphasizes that this is important, and that it's very hard to be saved, that it's as hard for a rich man to be saved as it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Yet nevertheless, you still see quite a lot of rich Christians. So again, it's something that they don't want to accept, and they don't. They're clearly making up their own minds as to what it is that is right or wrong. They're not using the scriptures as a guide to ethical living. Okay, so the third claim that we find religious people then make is that they may say, all right, so there is a right or wrong independently of God. It's also true that we are selective, we use our own judgment in deciding which of the scriptures we'll follow and which we won't follow. But without a God, we wouldn't have the motivation to do what's right. And this again is what Ivan Karamazov says according to Dostoevsky. He says at one point, without immortality, there would be no virtue. So it's the afterlife that is the kind of motivation for us doing the right thing. We will be rewarded or punished in the afterlife according to what we've done. And so ultimately, it is a selfish motivation on this view for doing what's right, but it's a kind of enlightened self-interest once we understand the way things are. Now, this ought to really be quite a powerful motivation for doing what's right, if you think about it. If you really believe, try and put yourself in the state of mind of somebody who really believes that if you do what's right, you will be eternally rewarded in a blissful state in heaven, and if you do something seriously wrong, you will be punished forever after in hell. For anyone with a decent kind of time horizon, you know, who doesn't just think short term, that ought to make a really big difference. And it is actually, I think, psychologically interesting, says something about human beings, that it doesn't seem to make a difference when you compare the behavior of religious people and non-religious people. If we compare today, for example, those societies that are relatively more religious and those societies that are more secular, among industrialized nations, you need to hold things reasonably constant in other ways. So among industrialized nations, clearly the United States is unusually religious for a modern industrialized nation. And Europe, with a couple of exceptions, maybe Poland and perhaps still Ireland, is much more secular. But Europe is, by many measures, I would say, a morally better society than the more religious United States. Certainly the murder rate is far lower. The number of people in prison is far lower. You would think, well, if people believe in eternal punishment, why do you need to threaten them with punishment here? But obviously you do. Although Jesus is reported, as I said, as saying that God will save those who fed the hungry, given drink to the thirsty, and clothed the naked, if you're weak and vulnerable, you'll be much better off in Europe, which generally has a decent welfare service and universal health coverage, than you will be in the United States, which, of course, as you know, is still struggling to get universal health coverage. When it comes to helping the poor as well, the record of almost all the European nations is far better than that of the United States. For example, Sweden, which is a relatively secular society, gives about 4 times as much in proportion to its gross national income as the United States. The United States has the highest juvenile mortality rates, that is death for young people, and pretty much the shortest lifespans. It has the highest abortion rate, despite opinion against abortion being much higher, according to polls. Highest abortion rates among democracies where abortion is legal, of course, and the highest sexually transmitted disease infection rates, and the highest teen pregnancy rates as well. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the fact that we've had a lot of publicity in recent years about not just Christians in general, but these religious leaders, priests, evangelical leaders and others, who are constantly talking about sin and yet seem to be unable to stop themselves from a wide variety of what they themselves consider to be the most vile kinds of sins for which they might well expect on their beliefs to be punished. So you have to assume that belief in hellfire is really not very efficacious in controlling behaviour. Now, I think we have to be balanced here. I can't say that atheists have a fantastic record of being virtuous either. We've certainly had all sorts of atrocities committed by atheists, such as Stalin and Pol Pot. There's no doubt of that. But we have comparable atrocities committed by Christians through the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the 30 Years' War, and so on. And I'm certainly not going to concede to the religious moralists the claim that Hitler was an atheist. He's often lumped with Stalin and Pol Pot among the terrible atheists of the 20th century. But Hitler certainly talked a lot about God. He may not have been an orthodox Catholic as he was brought up, but he certainly talked a lot about God if you read his table talk. And the German army had belt buckles that were inscribed with the words Gott mit uns, God with us. So I don't think we can place the Nazis in the atheist side of the spectrum. And of course, it's not only Christians either that we should be concerned about here. We've had innumerable conflicts over the centuries between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, in which all sorts of atrocities have also been committed. And of course, we have, as one of the threats to peace today, religious fanatics of Islamic persuasion who blow themselves up, reassured with the idea that this will win them a place in paradise. These seem to be perhaps the only religious people who are really confident in a place in paradise if they do what they believe to be the right thing, unfortunately. If we look at the more positive side of good behaviour, it's sometimes said that Christians give more to charity than secular people. There's some support for that if you look at the statistics about how much is given to charity in the United States, but if you look at what charities people are giving to, the largest slice of the charitable pie in the United States is religious institutions themselves. So perhaps that accounts for some of the fact that religious people are giving more. They're giving to support the church and the salaries of their religious institutions where they are. It's worth noting that despite the fact that, as I said, Jesus has all this emphasis on helping the poor, 3 of the 4 greatest philanthropists in history concerned with helping the poor and promoting the general good have been non-believers. I'm referring to Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Andrew Carnegie. The exception among the top 4 is John D. Rockefeller, who was a Protestant. But of the contemporary philanthropists, Gates and Buffett stand out. They've given more, even adjusted for inflation. They've given more than any other human being in history, and they have given it to deal with the greatest problems of the world that affect the poor. To, for example, develop cures for diseases like malaria, where there's not enough money going into research because most of the market would be in the developing world where people are too poor to provide a profitable market for the drug companies. It's clear that people can be motivated to do what's best without religious belief. One of my greatest colleagues in the animal movement was a man called Henry Spira, who I think has also done an enormous amount to reduce the amount of pain and suffering in the universe, because he was the most effective animal rights activist, I think, in the late 20th century. Henry Spira never had much money. His form of philanthropy was to devote time and energy and his very considerable intellect to finding effective ways to help the downtrodden and the oppressed. Not only animals, incidentally. He marched for civil rights in the South in the 60s. He worked for the labour unions for union reform against corrupt union movements in the Merchant Marine, where he served for a while, and also, of course, for non-human animals. Towards the end of his life, he had cancer. He knew he didn't have very long to live, and I interviewed him to make a video so that others could learn from his methods and his general philosophy. And I asked him, given that he was an atheist and that he regarded death as the end of his existence, what had driven him to spend his life working for others? And he replied, I guess basically one wants to feel that one's life has amounted to more than just consuming products and generating garbage. I think that one likes to look back and say that one's done the best one can to make this a better place for others. You look at it from this point of view. What greater motivation can there be than doing whatever one possibly can to reduce pain and suffering? Thank you.